UST textures are a fascinating oddity found in highly fractionated igneous rocks that are commonly associated with some types of ore deposits, particularly porphyry and IRG type systems. And this is one of the most spectacular examples I've ever seen. UST stands for Unidirectional Solidification Textures. If I'm going to talk about USTs, I have to mention Doug Kirwin. He's probably seen, documented and collected more USTs than any other geologist alive today. Many of the photos you'll see in this video are from his collection. The term originated in the metallurgical literature to describe crystal growth patterns in cooling metal melts, where crystals nucleate on the walls of a mould and grow inwards towards the remaining melt. In a geological context, they represent crystallization in an igneous intrusion, progressing away from the wall rock contact into the magma chamber. They usually occur as layers of quartz crystals at or near the upper contacts of small plugs of acid igneous rocks. This one here is in a granophyric microgranite plug that's about 1 kilometre long and 300 metres wide. There are a few examples in rocks of intermediate composition, but they're much less common. In almost all cases, there's evidence that the host magma was strongly fractionated and enriched with water and other volatiles. They're characterised by subparallel bands of quartz crystals that all point in the same direction. The bands are separated by layers of igneous rock. The layers of quartz crystals are subparallel to the contact, individual crystals have flat bottoms, and the terminations point away from the contact into the magma chamber. In outcrop, they look a bit like quartz veins, and in fact they're often marked as quartz veins on historical maps. In detail, they can actually look like one side of a quartz vein, with euhedral quartz crystals growing off the wall, but there's no opposing set of crystals growing the opposite direction from the other side of the vein. And the material between the quartz is igneous rock rather than hydrothermal minerals, in this case a granophyric microgranite. Quartz is by far the most common mineral to make this texture, but there are examples defined by bands of feldspars, magnetite, chalcopyrite and molybdenite. In fact, almost any mineral you can find in an intrusive-related mineral deposit, you can also find in UST bands. There are lots of variations on the general banded theme depending on the size of the crystals, the spacing of the layers and their degree of contortion. The pattern that you see depends heavily on the way you view the layers. And you might not always see that layering. In this case, it just looks like a large mass of quartz, but it has some hexagonal indentations from the quartz terminations that were pointing downwards. And here's a piece here where you can see almost perfect hexagonal terminations of the quartz crystals that were growing down into the magma chamber. It's flipped upside down now, so they're pointing up. And if you look at a face cut the other way, you can see that layering of the UST. The proportion of quartz to rock varies enormously, from just a few thin layers of quartz in an igneous rock to something like this, where almost all of the rock is quartz layers. The size of the quartz crystals also varies enormously, from just 1 millimetre or 2 up to many centimetres like this one here. The upper surface of the bands is usually planar, but it's rarely flat. In fact, it's often wildly contorted, giving rise to the popular name of brain rock. The degree of contortion in the layers can be exaggerated dramatically by the angle that the sample is cut. Gently curved layers will appear strongly contorted if the rock is cut at a small angle to the UST layers. In the most extreme case, where the rock is cut subparallel to the UST layers, you'll see isolated elliptical shapes that are sometimes referred to as atoll texture. The terminations can point inward or outward around the atolls depending on whether the UST layer curves above or below the cut surface. The relationship between the crystal layers also depends on how much magmatic material separates them. When the layers of igneous material are thin, relative to the size of the quartz crystals, each quartz layer roughly mirrors the one above. Layers that are widely spaced tend to have unrelated curves. At the extreme end of that spectrum, where the igneous material is only a few grains thick, individual quartz grains can continue to grow with the same crystal structure. That results in the so-called herringbone structure. If the same rock is cut parallel to the quartz layers, and hence perpendicular to the C-axis of the quartz crystals, you'll see concentric hexagonal bands of quartz outlined by thin bands of feldspar grains. There's a crystal there with a termination, a thin band of silicate minerals, then another growth zone, another band of silicate minerals, another growth zone, and then ultimately the final crystal shape up here. USTs were first described in a geological context by a Russian woman in 1951, but it'd be another 10 years before she was allowed to publish her work in a paper in 1961. They were subsequently rediscovered in the mid-1970s by geologists working at the Climax and Henderson porphyry molybdenum mines. At the time, they thought they might be a unique indicator of that style of mineralization. But as it turns out, they were then discovered in many other intrusive-related mineral systems, including porphyry coppers and IRG-type gold deposits. Doug Kirwin outlines a great history of how that understanding evolved, and I'll leave a link to his video about it up here. The formation process for USTs is the subject of considerable conjecture, but the two most likely processes revolve around magmas that are saturated with water and other volatiles. One idea is that the crystal layers grow directly in the silicate melt at the crystallization front. I'll call that the magmatic model. An alternate theory suggests that the layers grow in pools of hydrothermal fluid that collect at the top of a magma chamber. I'll call that the hydrothermal model. Both models start with a silicate melt that's nearly saturated with dissolved water and other volatile components. Crystallization starts at the wall of the magma chamber, and a crystallization front proceeds inwards. Growing feldspars exclude water from their crystal structure, and the water and other volatiles gets fractionated into the remaining melt. As crystallization continues, the melt becomes saturated and the fluid pressure increases. In the magmatic model, quartz crystals begin to grow on the crystallization front. That makes sense because the stability field for quartz in a QAP diagram expands dramatically as you increase the fluid pressure. The water and volatiles concentrated in the adjacent melt act as a flux, reducing the viscosity and allowing silica to diffuse rapidly towards the growing crystals. At some point, the adjacent layer of melt cools enough to stop the diffusion, and a layer of rock crystallizes. That crystallization fractionates water and volatiles into the melt below, and the cycle repeats. Muller, Kirwin and Zeltman 2023 referred to this as a closed system model, because no fluid escapes the system during UST formation. The longer each pressure cycle lasts, the larger the quartz crystals can grow. This model explains why the layers are usually subparallel to the walls of the intrusion, and why the crystals always point inward towards the magma chamber. The problem I see with that theory is that you would expect to see bands of quartz phenocrysts, more abundant or less abundant depending on the fluid pressure. And that's generally not what you see. In the hydrothermal model, immiscible bubbles of hydrothermal fluid exsolve from the melt as it reaches saturation. The buoyant bubbles make their way up through the silicate melt to the top of the intrusion and collect in a pool along the crystallization front. Quartz crystals nucleate on the roof of the pool and grow into the fluid. Fluid continues to exsolve from the silicate melt and accumulate in the pool, increasing the fluid pressure. When the fluid pressure overcomes lithostatic pressure and rock strength, fractures breach the chamber and the fluid escapes. The silicate melt comes back into contact with the quartz layer, and the sudden drop in pressure quenches the melt to crystallize a layer of rock. Quartz precipitates in the fractures and seals up the system. Crystallization resumes in the remaining melt and the cycle repeats. This is sometimes referred to in the literature as an open system model, because fluid escape is part of the process. With that mechanism, it's much easier to explain how you get that very sudden removal of all the fluid from the system and that switch back to igneous crystallization. The sudden switch from coarse crystal growth to fine aggregate growth suggests a rapid change of conditions, which is much easier to explain with a fluid escape. A crystallization mechanism driven purely by inward cooling should result in some directional textures or grain size banding in the rock layers. The smooth initiation surface that is common to almost all UST layers is a problem for the magmatic model, because an advancing crystallization front in a silicate melt is unlikely to be smooth, particularly if the melt contains abundant phenocrysts. A pool of hydrothermal fluid is more likely to explain the very sharp transition from rock to the next UST layer. The hydrothermal model also explains the rooftop location and high overall quartz content of USTs more effectively. The large density difference between hydrothermal fluid bubbles and surrounding silicate melt would result in strong buoyant force to move the bubbles upward toward the roof of the magma chamber. The ascending bubbles would also move dissolved silica towards the growing UST bands very effectively. Reduced viscosity of the melt due to fluxing effects of dissolved volatiles would also assist the ascent of the bubbles. More fluid, more fractionation, more layers of quartz. Less fluid, less fractionation, more bands of igneous material. When the magma finally runs out of heat, some of the bubbles of immiscible fluid that were on their way to the top get trapped in the partially crystallized mush before they reach the pool above. That explains why it's very common to find mineralitic cavities inside the intrusive below UST layers. Those mineralitic cavities are basically small cavities of hydrothermal fluid into which you can see crystals of quartz, often feldspar, sometimes sulfides, exactly as you'll find in some UST layers. But this model also has some problems. The biggest question is why we don't see any crystals that have grown from the floor of the pool in the opposite direction to those that grow from the roof. That might be because the floor is a silicate melt without nucleation sites, while the roof is crystallized rock with existing quartz grains to nucleate crystal growth. A number of studies have looked at fluid inclusions in the quartz from the UST bands and in quartz phenocrysts from the rock bands. Both types of quartz contain a mixture of liquid inclusions and silicate melt inclusions, indicating that the crystals came into contact with both hydrothermal fluid and silicate melt as they grew. This might be explained by a process somewhere between the magmatic and hydrothermal models, where quartz crystals grow in a froth of silicate melt and hydrothermal fluid bubbles, as suggested here by Seo et al. For a UST in South Korea. The hydrothermal model is also supported by fluid inclusions in UST quartz that generally have homogenization temperatures below the solidus temperature for silicate melts. However, recent work by Muller et al. Using the titanium in quartz thermometer suggests that UST quartz actually grows in the range of 590 to 770 degrees C, which is around the solidus temperature for water-saturated silicate melts. The hydrothermal model explains why the quartz bands resemble one side of a quartz vein, because the crystals are growing off a solid wall into a cavity filled with hydrothermal fluid, just as they do in a vein. It also explains why most of the other minerals found as UST bands are also commonly found in high-temperature hydrothermal veins. But euhedral shapes are no guarantee that the crystals grew in a hydrothermal fluid. Quartz is entirely capable of growing euhedral crystals in a silicate melt. This crystal is a phenocryst from a dacite porphyry near Kapan in Armenia. Looking down the C-axis, you can see the perfect hexagonal shape, and side on you can see neat terminations at both ends. Here's one of those phenocrysts in the original dacite porphyry host rock, and you can see that the quartz had no problem pushing aside feldspar phenocrysts to grow the euhedral shape. There are also lots of examples of UST bands with highly irregular crystal terminations that seem unlikely to have developed in a hydrothermal fluid. A major problem with the hydrothermal model is that it predicts that there should be lots of quartz veins that terminate at UST bands, and I've never actually seen that relationship in outcrop. Exploration geologists get excited about USTs because they're an indicator of highly fractionated fluid-rich magmas that are a key driver in many intrusive-related hydrothermal mineral deposits. But the relationship between UST formation and mineralization isn't clear-cut. There are a few molybdenum, gold and tin deposits where the economic minerals precipitate directly in the UST bands or in associated mineralitic cavities. But in the vast majority of systems, the economic mineralization is in veins or breccias that overprint the UST rocks. We know that USTs represent the very earliest stage of crystallization in magma because they start at or near the wall rock contact, so it's no surprise that most of the hydrothermal action comes after that. In classical porphyry system models, granular A-type veins represent the earliest fluid exsolving from the magma, and even those early veins are commonly seen cutting UST bands. Mineralization in those systems is usually in later banded or centerline B-type veins, and even later comb-textured D-type veins with phyllic alteration halos. And in fact, that's exactly what you see here. There's numerous examples of UST bands cut by quartz veins, and here you can see a couple of wiggly UST bands coming through here in this granophyric microgranite host, and right there, that band is cut by one of those granular banded centerline veins, and here, just a few meters above that outcrop of UST textures, in the same granophyric microgranite, you can see a swarm of sheeted granular quartz veins, some of which have that beautiful centerline texture. Since all of those vein types are seen to cut USTs, there's probably a substantial time gap between the UST development and the mineralizing stage in most intrusive-related mineralization systems. One exception to that rule occurred in the Ridgeway porphyry copper-gold deposit. It's part of the Cadia group of deposits in New South Wales, Australia. The deposit was associated with a spine-like monzonite porphyry intrusion that was entirely blind within a sequence of volcaniclastic sediments. Dr. Alan Wilson studied the deposit for his PhD. During mining, a horizontal UST layer approximately 1.4 metres thick and 30 metres long was exposed in a drive near the top of one of the porphyry phases in the plug. Alan captured these extraordinary images of the UST bands in the wall of the drive. The quartz bands range from about 10 to 300 millimetres thick, with flat upper surfaces and euhedral terminations below. The orange layers are monzonite porphyry and the dark bands are magmatite. Apart from the unusual host rock, it's one of the few examples where there is good evidence of copper mineralization precipitated at the time of the UST formation, rather than as a later overprint. In this slab collected from the drive, you can see that the chalcopyrite occurs almost exclusively in the quartz bands, so it's unlikely to have been introduced by overprinting fractures or breccia that would have affected the entire rock. In detail, you can see euhedral quartz terminations in this cluster of chalcopyrite and magnetite. That suggests that the sulfide and magnetite filled interstitial spaces between the quartz crystals rather than later fractures that cut the crystals. You can also see that most of the sulfide clusters contain no feldspar grains, suggesting that the silicate melt was excluded from the band during the precipitation of quartz, magnetite and sulfide. While there's clear evidence for copper mineralization at the time of the UST formation, it's important to note that the majority of the copper-gold ore at Ridgeway was in stockworks of B-type veins. In both models, there is also the question of why the crystal bands get so contorted. I think it might be the result of a room problem created as the quartz crystals grow on the crystallization front. New crystals would likely nucleate on existing quartz grains in the roof of the magma chamber. These grains would be separated by some space because the newly crystallized rock is a mixture of feldspar and quartz. As the quartz crystals grow, they'll eventually meet each other. Continued crystal growth will force the UST layer to expand its area, but since the grains are attached to the roof, they can't move. The result will be a wrinkling of the surface. You can see that mechanism in action if you put your hand in water for an extended period. Your skin expands as it absorbs water, but it's attached to the tissue below, so it wrinkles to accommodate the expansion. Of course, this would require some deformation of the rock behind the UST layer, but that shouldn't be a problem since it would be only just below the melting temperature at this point and hence quite plastic. Regardless of the formation process, it's clear that UST textures are a great indicator for fluid-rich magmas, and fluid-rich magmas are a key driver for many hydrothermal mineral deposits. Unfortunately, most of the mineral deposit styles that are associated with these processes form in veins, stockworks and breccias above where the fluid's being generated in the magma chamber. So if you're seeing USTs, those deposits have probably already been eroded off. But there's a couple of exceptions to that. Porphyry molybdenum deposits is one example that we talked about, but there's also some other IRGD styles where the mineralization occurs at the same level as the USTs and the mineralitic cavities below them. There's no guarantee that every system with USTs will also have an ore body. But it's also important to remember that these systems are long-lived and they have multiple pulses of activity that reach different levels in the crust. And in the meantime, parts of the crust are being pushed up and eroded down during the lifetime of the system. So it's entirely possible to find other parts of the system that are eroded to more favourable levels. The Ridgeway example was a graphic illustration of that, where a porphyry phase with UST textures and weak mineralisation intruded at the same level as an earlier phase with high-grade stockwork mineralisation. So if you see an outcrop with UST textures, you know that at least one pulse of magma in that system had a lot of fluid in it. And it's entirely likely that there'll also be other pulses with fluid, and consequently it's worth spending considerable effort to look around that system for other parts that are exposed at more favourable levels. So now I'm about 1 kilometre west of that nice UST outcrop, around the contact of that same little microgranite plug, and right here is a beautiful example of a swarm of B veins in that microgranite right near the contact, with the typical banded texture that you see parallel to the walls. So here you can see that typical randomly oriented stockwork of the veins. There's a big one over here, and there's one here with that classic centre line in the middle. The vague bands on either side are fine layers of magnetite, and that centre line is a thin layer of gossan after sulphide. I'll put a bit of water on it here, maybe it'll help to see it a bit better. So there you go, you can see that bigger one there, that's actually got a little bit of a centre line in it as well. There's another one here, it's got lots of magnetite in it there. And this one here, you can see those fine bands of magnetite parallel to the wall, giving a slightly darker grey colour, and that centre line of gossan after the sulphide. And this is the microgranite porphyry in between. It might have a bit of K-feldspar alteration, but you see there's no halos on the veins. That's absolutely typical characteristic of B veins. They never have halos on them unless they're overprinted by later D veins that often carry the mineralisation. So if you find a nice outcrop of UST texture, try and identify the intrusion that it's hosted in, and then really carefully map that intrusion, and particularly look around the contacts of that intrusion and try and figure out where the top of it is, because that's the part that's likely to have mineralisation. It probably won't be exactly where the USTs are, but somewhere nearby in the same intrusion or some closely related intrusion nearby.